Hi, and welcome everybody today. We appreciate you joining us for the Preparing for Your First SOC 2 Examination webcast. I'm Karen Cardillo. I am a director in Forvis Mazars National SOC and HITRUST practice. I'm sitting in the Raleigh, North Carolina office. I have been with the firm, or I guess part of the firm, for about 3 years. For those of you who aren't familiar with Forvis Mazars, we started by a merger between BKD and DHG to become Forvis, and then recently an acquisition with Mazars USA created Forvis Mazars. So been with the firm for about 3 years, and then prior to that was with another top firm for about 12 years, focusing purely on SOC. So I'll let Ryan introduce himself, and then we'll kick it off.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Excited to be here. Excited to present with Karen. I'm a principal in our national SOC and HITRUST practice. Been with legacy firms for going on 15 years as well. Really passionate about this space. As Karen said, Forvis Mazars is a relatively new brand, but I think we bring decades of experience to this space, and really just excited about the conversation today. We've got a really good topic, I feel like. So if you're going through maybe your first SOC 2, or you're on the fence and you're thinking about, hey, we're getting some requests for SOC 2, you're at the right space right here. We're going to go through really some basics of, hey, what is a SOC report and why you should consider it, maybe compare it to some other options in the industry, as well as just kind of hone in on, hey, what is a SOC 2? So if you're getting questions about that, so you can be better prepared to answer those questions. And then really going into a deep dive on kind of step-by-step how to prepare and actually be successful in a SOC 2 examination. One thing to note, we really want some questions. I think it'd be great to have some collaboration during today's webinar. So definitely use that Q&A function. If you see a topic you want us to go into more detail on, or if you have a question just about your experience, we would appreciate that. Karen and I have a little bit of competition going on as far as who gets the most questions, so definitely pulling for me to win that. But with that, we're going to kick things off with a polling question, and I'll pull that up now. And so I'm going to kind of summarize these, probably a long sentence to read, but really the first question here is, if you are currently negotiating kind of in a contract negotiation with a customer or client who's asking for your organization to get a SOC 2, wanting to kind of understand if that's where you sit, or if you're maybe a part of a information technology or third-party risk team and you're just looking to learn more about, hey, what does your SOC 2 journey look like? And then I guess for those that are on the call, that are looking, hey, I'm here for CPE, and maybe just want to understand what SOC 2 is all about. And the last one is, you're already going through a SOC 2, but maybe you're looking to see how Forvis Mazars may approach this differently as our national SOC and HITRUST practice. I think, this is going to really help inform us where our audience is. So definitely want to get participation on this poll, and we'll try to gauge who we have in the audience and tailor our presentation to that. All right, so great results here. I think, again, for those in that third category, that are here for maybe CPE, sit tight. We're going to definitely get you those hours with some polling questions, so stay tuned there. But those that are in that negotiation, or wanting to learn more, you've gone through that SOC 2, we definitely kind of appreciate your attendance and definitely want to dive into, hey, what can we present to you guys to help make sure that journey is successful? So we're going to go through just a few basics for all of our audience to understand, really why a SOC report. And I think we get this question a lot from our prospects and even our current clients that maybe get questions on, is there other reports that we should consider? And so I'm going to go through a little bit of an overview of what you may hear in the industry. So SOC has been around for a number of years. For those that are in maybe the accounting profession, it's based off a AICPA guidance. That guidance name has changed year over year. It started back in, SAS 70, so you may have heard that term. You may also hear SSAE 21, 18, 16. So you can hear we've been through multiple iterations of that guidance. But SOC reporting, from our perspective, is a great fit for any organization that wants to report on your controls. It is really an opportunity for you to say, here to my customers, here's what I'm doing to protect your information, to process your information, to provide continuity of that service. And so it is a kind of one size fits all report. And I would say from our perspective, we feel like it's probably the best option to pursue in comparison to other types of reports out there. So you may hear of HITRUST. That's for probably more of your healthcare focused entities. So it's very industry specific. You may hear of ISO 27001. That's going to be more international focused. And so you can start to realize that while there's other options out there, SOC reporting tends to lend itself to being more industry agnostic, as well as widely accepted by customer third-party risk professionals, as well as procurement teams looking to gain that level of assurance on what you are doing as an organization. Now, you'll see that you've got a couple of readers of SOC reports. So who is going to actually receive those? And so, a lot of our reports go to customers who want to understand, how you protect that information, what are you doing with the information that you may receive from that customer. And so that's going to be the users and user entities right in the middle of your screen. And then for our CPAs in the audience, or, for our professionals that are maybe performing audit work, there are reports designed to kind of go straight to that auditor, to be an auditor to auditor communication, to gain that assurance in a financial audit. And then the service organization is really potentially you as an audience member. You are potentially looking to provide that SOC report out to customers. You would be what is termed a service organization. So ultimately, we feel like SOC reporting has come a long way from SAS 70 to SSAE 21 now. And we feel like there's definitely momentum in this space, especially SOC 2, as we continue to see it's more of an opportunity to move upstream. So in your sales cycle, you may see more and more contractual obligations to report on your security. And that's where I think SOC report really becomes a value proposition to your organization. Yes, there is a level of effort to get there, and we're going to go through that in detail. But ultimately, we think there's a return on that investment pretty quickly. Once you get that report in place, you start to issue that out to your customers. Ideally, right, you start to move upstream pretty quickly, and you get the bigger opportunities because you have that report in hand, and you can go to market with that report through sales or just reputation from there as well. So happy to go into more detail if you have questions about this, but from our perspective, SOC is a great ROI for the level of effort. We wanted to spend just a minute or two just to quickly kind of cut through any confusion. We're going to throw probably a few acronyms at you and try to clarify those throughout the conversation. SOC 1 compared to SOC 2, can get confusing. And so a lot of our calls, I know Karen and I are on a lot of, initial calls with customers, and they say, we need a SOC report. And then we start to explain, okay, we have a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, and then their eyes get blurry and they get really lost really quickly. So let's just kind of cut to what the differences are. And so SOC 1 is really going to be that auditor to auditor communication designed to really report on your controls to a financial auditor. It's also probably termed internal controls over financial reporting focused. And so it's really designed, if you're processing a transaction, if you're trying to communicate completeness and accuracy of data to a customer, I would say SOC 1 is probably going to be an opportunity to focus on. Now, our focus today is SOC 2, and you can see the different categories here, security through privacy. And it is really designed, it was based off the fact that back in the SAS 70 days, auditors were issuing a SOC 1 or a SAS 70 report, and it was kind of all encompassing. And the AI CPA said, hey, time out, we need to design a report that can be easily compared from vendor A to vendor B to vendor C. And so they developed this platform, SOC 2, the categories here, so that you as an organization can issue a SOC report and almost be compared against your peers or your competitors and showcase maybe how well you're doing from a control perspective. And so I'd say if you're in the technology space as well, you can see SOC 2 is going to be more focused on that information technology aspect of your business versus maybe business process or processing transactions. And so ultimately, when you start this journey, it's good to understand maybe why you're going down one path or the other. We do have some organizations that issue both a SOC 1 and a SOC 2. But if you're just starting out and you maybe have never issued a SOC report out of your organization and you're getting that question for a SOC 2, just recognize that there are other options, and it's really important to read that fine print in your contract. So when we start conversations, it's really important for us to look at, hey, what is the contract mandate you issue? And we want to understand that so we can definitely provide the most value to you and your organization. So by reading that contract, understanding the stipulations of what type of report to issue, we really help you set up for success, kind of SOC 1 versus SOC 2. And so let's kind of quickly dive into the different 5 categories. So you can see they're listed here. We're going to go into a really detailed analysis of each. So for this slide's purpose, right, we just want to recognize that going back to that contract, if you get a request for a SOC 2 and that's it, we have a lot of flexibility in that interpretation. I'd say if you're in the third-party risk management space, your organization, and you're asking for organizations to issue a SOC 2 report, it is really important and really more clear to actually stipulate, is it a SOC 2 with security? Is it with availability? Is it with privacy? And make sure that you know what you're asking for. And that way, you as an organization, if you're issuing a report, can issue the right report to your customers. And there's obviously drivers behind each of these categories. And so let's dive into that and kind of be more clear on what each category means. So I'd say for most of our clients, right, if you're starting this journey, you want to start with a SOC 2 with security. You have to assess security. That is a required category for all SOC 2s. But you don't want to lose sight of maybe this is your initial audit. You've never gone through an organizational audit before. So maybe there's a little bit of nervous a tendency to say, hey, let's don't boil the ocean all at once. And so I typically tell most of my new clients, hey, start with a SOC 2 with just security. Let's put that out to the market, and then let's wait and hear of any feedback. And probably 80% of the time, we don't get any feedback. We issue that SOC 2, it's an unqualified opinion, a good opinion, and that meets the needs of our users. Now sometimes, depending on what the organization does, especially in the technology space, if we have a processing role in that organization's IT environment, we need to assess the security, but then we also want to talk about business continuity, disaster recovery. And that's where availability starts to really come into play and become a valuable option to add to security. So we would issue a SOC 2 with availability and security. And then you can see as we go through the list here, processing integrity is, I would say, the closest thing to a SOC 1. So I mentioned kind of completeness and accuracy previously about a SOC 1. If you're processing a transaction, maybe you're in the insurance industry and you're processing a claim, there may be a value proposition to report on how you process those claims completely and accurately and timely. And so we can issue a SOC 2 with security and availability and processing integrity. And so there's opportunities to incrementally add processing integrity to your scope. Now, again, that just depends on your organization. What are you doing for the industry? And so that's really important to understand what is process integrity, and then is it valuable to your organization to add? So let's talk about confidentiality. Confidentiality, to me, there's a lot of confusion between confidentiality and privacy. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But confidentiality is, we've made, we maybe have an agreement between our organization and our customer to maintain the confidentiality of their data. Maybe we stipulate that through contracts or MSAs of some form or fashion, or maybe in healthcare, we have a business associate agreement in place. And so maintaining the confidentiality of the information that we receive from our customers is maybe really pivotal to your organization. And so if that is the case, confidentiality may be really valuable for you to report on, and may be stipulated by your customers to have that in place as well. And then the last one, and I'd say, again, just depends on the organization, is privacy. And as we progress into more of a digital age of all things being online, data privacy continues to be a hot topic. And I would say more organizations are asking, what type of information do we maintain of customers, of end users, of data subjects? And so there may be an opportunity for us to report on, how do we obtain that information through a collection process? How do we use that information? Is that authorized use of that information? If we retain that information for a period of time, how long do we retain it? How do we dispose of it? And if we do disclose it to other parties, maybe it's upstream or downstream in the business cycle, how do we disclose to that data subject that we have provided your information to another third party? And so kind of wrapping all 5 categories together, you can see we paint a very broad picture of your organization's control environment. And so again, starting with security as a baseline, you have a lot of opportunities to incrementally add to that scope based off your organization and how you guys may process data. And so let's talk about level of effort. I think this is a big question we always get is, hey, we're starting our SOC 2 journey. We want to know, okay, what is just security? And if we want to add availability, what is that extra level of effort? And so I think this slide does a great job. I'd say if you're writing down a note, this is a great slide to understand, okay, if we're starting this journey and we want to understand what is the next iteration of our SOC 2 look like, or should we go from security to privacy to confidentiality? How do we add on different categories? By understanding the criteria assigned to each category, you kind of quickly come to a conclusion of the level of effort to add on additional components. And so you can see security with 33, you can incrementally add availability for just 3 additional criteria. So the level of effort to add availability is much lower than just the initial level of effort for security. And then for confidentiality and process integrity, 5 and 2 criteria. So again, you can see not a huge jump in level of effort. And so there may be a value proposition to add those. But I think the big one here is privacy with 17 criteria. That is where I would say most of our clients say, well, we want to add privacy. We want to have a SOC 2 that reports on our data security and our data privacy. Well, that's important. That's great to understand that request, but understanding the level of effort and maybe your team's ability to respond to that level of effort is really important as well. So I'd say, again, if you're taking notes, great slide is to jot down some overviews here, because going back to your team and saying, hey, let's do a SOC 2 with security is a lot different conversation than doing a SOC 2 with all 5 categories or maybe just one additional one. All right, and so I mentioned the differences between confidentiality and privacy. And so again, if your organization is obtaining some type of protected health information or personally identifiable information, we do think privacy should be on your radar. Maybe it's not your first iteration of your SOC report, but we believe there's a value proposition to consider privacy in the future. And I'd say, especially our organizations, if you're in an organization that has a component or maybe is headquartered in the EU, which has a very big data privacy requirement through GDPR, there is an opportunity to report on data privacy in your SOC 2 that would help maybe explain the controls you have in place to comply with GDPR. It's not going to be a safe harbor for GDPR. It's not going to be it's not going to, meet that mandate, but it's going to be an opportunity for you to start that conversation with your customers. And so again, if you have that information, we do think it's important to at least consider having privacy or confidentiality in your SOC 2. And then just maybe not to muddy the water, right? But I told you we'd kind of throw some acronyms at you. As you start that journey, just remember that there's two types of a SOC 2. There's a type 1 and there's a type 2. And I'd say if you're looking at this slide and you're trying to understand the differences right off the bat, I'd say I draw your attention to the kind of middle of the slide deck where it says for the type 1 includes design and implementation. And then if you kind of look down to the second bullet point under SOC 2 type 2, you see the report includes design, implementation, and operating effectiveness. Is having that basic understanding, I think, is super important. But the kind of the layman term of the differences here is a SOC 2 type 1 is as of a certain date. So it's as of August 13th, 2024, whereas a SOC 2 type 2 is going to be over a period of time. It's going to be maybe from January 1st through September 30th. And it's going to provide assurance over that period of time through operating effectiveness control. So I know it was a lot of information we just covered, but just want to set the foundation of, hey, here's some basic things to consider as you're starting that journey, or if you maybe never looked at a SOC report, hopefully a good understanding of that, of what a SOC report is and the value proposition of that. And with that, let's go into our next poll. And so the poll is on a scale of 1 to 4. How familiar are you with SOC 2, of the SOC 2 framework and its trust service criteria? Hopefully everybody says expert, since I just did a great job explaining that. But obviously, give us your feedback here, and we'll go from there.
Ryan, while you were talking, you did get one question come in. So somebody noted that they work for a hospital and they basically work with a small vendor, but that vendor does help with data analysis and they have access to health PI data. And they want to see if there are other options besides a SOC report, because their understanding is that really a SOC report may be too expensive for such a small size, small business to undertake. So what would be the options there? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, every organization can scale their SOC report up or down. And so being a small organization probably doesn't, probably give you a pass on issuing a SOC report. We have some organizations that are, a dozen people, maybe even a little bit less. And so it just does depend on what the organization is doing. Do they develop that software? Do they, manage that software for that hospital? If that's the case, I'm not really sure there's a great other opportunity besides SOC reporting. Now, you could consider ISO or HITRUST, but both of those options are still pretty challenging to pursue. There are, other types of reports through the AICPA that can be very narrow in scope, but they're also limited in their use and their disclosure. So I'd say for that participant that asked that question, happy to take that offline and provide maybe some other options in a conversation.
Awesome.
Apparently I didn't do a very good job, Karen, on my overview of SOC 2, so I need to work on that.
I was going to say, somebody threw you a bone though down there with expert, so yeah. That's good.
But thank you for that feedback.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan, for kind of giving us that introduction. But the next thing I want to talk through is really the roadmap to being successful for the first time that you perform a SOC 2 examination. So just kind of starting with what I would say is the first step to this is really setting expectations. And that's really internally, right? So what you want to think about here is, why am I doing this report? What do my users expect to get out of this report, right? So as far as, who's allowed to perform this type of report, the actual examinations, like Ryan was talking about, the type 1 and the type 2, do have to be performed by an independent CPA firm. And that's because we're issuing an opinion on those controls. So keep that in mind when you're looking toward the actual examination itself. The other thing I would say is, when you're thinking about a timeline of how long it would take you to start to finish, generally we would say the expectation for that is between 12 and 18 months from starting your readiness assessment to getting your report. But in kind of typical auditor speak, it does depend, right? If you're really quick to close gaps or you've got a team fully dedicated, you might be able to do that quicker. If you're going to take your time, you need, extra time to clear gaps, it may take longer than that. So it's kind of give or take depending on what your organization has this from a priority level. So this kind of goes through high level what the roadmap looks like. I'm not going to read one by one because we're going to go through each one of these just to help you be successful in that first time through. So understanding the SOC 2 requirements. So SOC 2 is unlike some of the other reports in that the AICPA has defined the criteria. So even the CPA firms can't change the criteria. It is set by the AICPA. However, we can, fit controls into that criteria that they have outlined for us. The other thing that they did, which was great, when they first came out with the criteria, it was incredibly vague. And so CPA firms were, kind of taking what they think the criteria meant. And so what they did was they put together some points of focus to align with the criteria. So just as a quick example, one of the criteria says something along the lines of, you have a commitment to attract and develop talent, to retain talent. That is such a broad criteria, and you could define that in so many different ways. So the AICPA came back and said, here are some focus areas that we think guide, you toward meeting this criteria. And so they came out with things like, consider background checks and what that background of the individual looks like, or making sure that you're doing training periodically and those types of things. So they've more clearly defined what they're looking for. So when you're looking at overall the requirements for SOC 2, there is some guidance that, kind of lets you know what we're looking for when we're getting into those engagements. I will say one of the things I do think, that we are really good at is that we are taking controls that you have and really trying to help them fit. We don't always want to reinvent the wheel, right? That's not the goal of the SOC 2 readiness assessment. It's really to see how we're covering the risks that the AICPA has defined for each of these criteria. So setting the project scope is obviously incredibly important, right? It's like trying to, build a sandcastle or build a fort without having any sort of instructions. You have no idea what you're going to get. You may include way more things than you're supposed to, right? So, setting the project scope and what you want the outcome to look like is really a good thing for you to do from an organization as a whole. I will caution you, one of the most important things to do here is making sure that you're including the right people in these conversations. So a lot of times people think audit, so we should just include compliance or audit, or they think, oh, SOC 2 is IT, so we should just include IT. I would caution you to make sure you're including, people from each organization that would need to be represented. So yes, IT definitely. Human resources also big part of the SOC 2. So you want to make sure you're including those people in those conversations. Legal, I think legal should definitely be involved in these conversations. management as a whole, making sure, again, you have the right people at the table to have the discussions about the scope. SOC 2 is all about, what your service commitments and your system requirements are to users, right? So not everybody is fully aware of all of those things that you have on the table. So again, bringing everybody into this conversation can really help you narrow the scope to what your users are looking to see in this report. The other piece of this is definitely honing in on the system scope for a SOC 2. So you, can expand this as big and as small as you want, but I can tell you your users are probably not going to care about your internal payroll system, right? That's probably not something that they care about, but they are going to care about a system that houses their data or that, helps with the transaction piece of maybe a processing integrity piece. So those are the kind of things you want to think about, the systems that really matter to your users. And then the last piece when I'm thinking about scope is, are there any organizations that are helping me meet the criteria or meet these control activities? If they're performing some sort of the control, they may be what we call a subservice organization. So for example, if you host your systems in the cloud, AWS, Azure, something like that, that's definitely an organization that we would consider a subservice organization, or maybe somebody that's managing your IT services or your network security. And the key with a SOC 2 and a SOC 1 also, but we only want to test the controls that the organization that you all are performing, right? We aren't going to be testing, in most cases, what other providers are performing. So we want to focus on what you're doing as an organization and test that in the report. So the next slide about performing the internal gap analysis. So on my way to the office this morning, I was actually listening to a 2009 TED Talk that Bill Gates gave about the passion that he has for limiting deaths from malaria. So not related at all, but during this presentation, he opens a jar of mosquitoes into the audience and he lets them out. And he does this to really get the attention of the audience. So we are not in person and I don't have any mosquitoes to release into the audience today, but this to me is one of the most important slides in this presentation, and that is performing your own internal gap analysis. Because if you jump into a readiness assessment for SOC 2 and you have done no homework, not only are you going to waste your time, but you're also going to waste a lot of money, because we're going to give you a report that says you have 50 out of 55 gaps, right? And that doesn't do you any good. And so what I would say is, before jumping in with both feet, make sure that you do a little research, right? Look into what the criteria is requiring from a controls perspective, and talk to other CPA firms and figure out what's the best approach for me to get started, and really sit down and think, how do I evaluate my current organization's controls before I bring somebody in to get the most value out of that assessment, right? You want us or a third party to come in and really have something to look at. You want them to have transactions. You want there to be controls. You want us to truly evaluate you based on what you have. Just as a side note, halfway through the presentation, he told them that he had tested the mosquitoes and they didn't have malaria. So just in case anybody was curious, it was a safe experiment. But all that to say, to me, this is the most important part to be successful in doing a readiness assessment.
And Karen, maybe just a thought on this is, we have a lot of organizations that have developed an application and maybe they're ramping up to go to market. I'd say as part of that internal gap analysis, it is to make sure that system is in production or close to it before you start that readiness assessment, because we're not permitted to issue a SOC 2 on a beta system or in development system. It has to be in production. And so, yes, there's probably a little bit of a challenge there to make sure timing aligns, but, talking to your auditor before you, start that readiness assessment, have a clear understanding of what you need to have in place for that development life cycle, and make sure that the developers are considering controls as important, but also just make sure you have a timeline to go to production before you start readiness.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's awesome when someone is in the process of developing a system and they come to us and say, hey, we're not ready yet, but how do we get there? Because during their process of development, they can start implementing these controls ahead of time, which is the easiest way to do that, right? Sometimes trying to implement things after the fact makes it a lot more difficult. So, there's not too early to come to someone, but again, doing that gap analysis before, engaging into a full assessment is kind of where I was going with that. But yes, absolutely love to start early. That's a really good time to get somebody involved or start having those conversations. One of the ways that I think you can really kind of do that internal assessment is by starting with documenting policies and procedures. So if any of you have done, assessments like HITRUST or ISO, policies and procedures are super important to those engagements. It's not as much with SOC. We are going to test a handful of policies and making sure that you have them and they're documented and that type of thing. But what I think the policy and procedure comes in handy is really, so that you can understand what processes that the company currently has in place and what controls you currently have in place, right? So while you're having conversations with these business units, it's documenting, what they're doing, and then reading back through that and understanding, hey, I think we're missing something here. Or if you did do your homework and you looked at the criteria, let's just say change management, for example, it's super clear that you have to test and approve changes in the criteria. It straight up kind of says that in those points of focus. Well, if you're documenting your policy and procedure on change management and you don't see that part covered, or you're looking at a change ticket and you don't see that clearly lined out, that's a good way to assess that maybe we have some gaps in this area and we need to kind of dig deeper. So documenting that, not only so that you have it, clearly documented in a policy and procedure, also helps you gauge whether or not you kind of have some gap areas there. The other thing to note is, you do want to make sure that those policies are covering the key functions from a SOC reporting perspective. I did note these here, and I do want to list them only because, not everybody is as familiar with what's included in the SOC 2 report. And so we want to make sure you're covering access control. So logical access, also physical access, if that's something that would be in scope for your report. We want to cover change management, of course, data protection. There is a risk management section, a vendor management section. We want to make sure we cover those. Incident response is also a big piece. Most of the time I see a completely separate policy for that just because it's such a big area. And then really monitoring of everything, I always say, right? The more monitoring, the stronger your control environment can be. So just making sure, again, that you're documenting all of that, you're reviewing all of those policies at least annually, just to make sure that they're up to date and they really reflect, your current operating procedures. The next slide is about implementing the new policies and security controls. Obviously, it's great to have the policies, but once you've kind of got those documented and we're all, in agreement with the control owners and the group and the groups who are performing these, it's really making sure that we're actually implementing what we say we have, right? So as far as, excuse me, helping you to prioritize gap areas that you've identified, I think making sure that you have implemented what you say you're going to implement is the first part that I would start at, right? If I say I'm testing and approving controls in my policy, let's look to make sure that's actually what I'm doing, right? And then let's prioritize areas that we have gaps in. If some things are going to take longer to address than others, so maybe you give them a higher priority than, hey, we're missing this line in a policy, we should add it later. It really is all about kind of making sure that you've got a good game plan for, what you've assessed as gap areas before we get started. Implementing any missing technology, that is always going to be what I consider, those high dollar or maybe higher priority items, because those take a long time, right? If you need to implement new technology or new systems or new tools, sometimes that's just going to take a little bit longer. So again, making sure your priority level on those is in line with kind of how long it may take to clear those. The next slide is about providing training and awareness. So I will say it is great if you have a policy, and it is great if you have everything documented, but if you don't train the teams or your staff or your people on, what the expectations are, all you've really done is document a policy. So absolutely make sure that you have developed good training for all of your new procedures and kind of what your expectations are of the teams. And I would say, what we typically like to see here is that training is done at least annually, and it's given to people who are onboarded in a timely manner, right? We want to make sure everybody understands the expectations when they're onboarded and throughout the year. One thing I do want to note here, and this is just from experience, but make sure that you consider your contractors when you're looking at something like security awareness training, right? Contractors generally have access to certain information too. They generally kind of operate as, an employee in a lot of situations, but a lot of times they get missed when we're talking about security awareness training or just training in general, right? So always consider, whether or not, contractors should be involved here. And I would say in most cases, they really should be. And that goes across the board for your human resources types controls, right? The training, policy acknowledgements, background checks. I see more issues when we're doing readiness assessments for SOC 2s around the inclusion of contractors than I do really anything else. So just keep that in mind when you're talking about those kind of HR related items. And then once you've done that, as much as you can to prepare, to study, to get ready for the pre-test, then you can get started on that readiness assessment, right? And that is when you really need to get, your third party involved. And that is when they're going to jump in and review all the hard work that you've done to get ready, right? It's going to be basically kind of a walk through understanding first of, what have you done? Tell me what you have in place. Let me get an understanding of your control environment. And then what we would want to do during this phase is really test a sample of one transaction. So let me look at a change and walk me through the whole process. Let me look at a new user or a terminated user and walk me through that whole process, right? So actually testing an instance of that control to make sure we feel like it is designed appropriately and you have it implemented. And that goes back to what I said about the really important piece of doing your homework, because if we come in and there's nothing to look at, it's really not a value add exercise for you, right? We can write you 100 gaps if that's what you want, but that's not going to give you any value on whether you've implemented the right control, whether it's designed. And so the benefit really is testing the transactions during that readiness assessment. And then the other piece of the readiness assessment is really making sure that we have the right scope and that we can start kind of thinking about developing the description of the system for your type 2, right? Really kind of understanding, the ins and outs of the environment and then those subservice organizations, and really taking in as much as we can during this readiness to prepare us for the next step. And then at the end of that readiness assessment, the deliverable, at least from our perspective, not all firms will do things the same, but the deliverable is generally going to be a gap report. And so I generally describe this as, it'll have the parts that say, hey, you did these 50 things really well, and we feel comfortable with these controls. But there's these 10 items that maybe you haven't quite met, or you haven't met at all. And here are the things that we think you need to do to kind of get yourself in the place that you need to in order for us to move forward with the type 2. So that's the, the remediation piece of that. We're gonna guide you as much as you can. There is some independence that we have to think about as far as we can't implement any controls for you, but we can certainly guide you in the direction of, here are some options that you can take on to clear these gaps before we can move forward. And I would say it's really key for you as an organization to develop what those remediation plans are going to look like, get buy-in, management's buy-in, get team buy-in, and then really make kind of a prioritization. So these are our top priority. These may take a little longer, so let's get these done. And then establishing kind of those timelines in line with when you want to get started with your type 2 examination. So all of that, gap remediation tracking, this is the part that's the, it depends piece, how long it takes. And it really is how many resources you have to dedicate to this, how much time you have to dedicate to this. But that is completely kind of on your timeline of what you're looking for. And then the last slide in this section is about really just beginning that SOC 2 examination, right? So the key point here is that before we do a type 1 or a type 2, all of your gaps need to be addressed. Sometimes I get questions on this for the type 2. Well, I'm doing a 1/1 to 12/31 report. Can I still clear gaps in March because I'm in my reporting period? And the answer to that is no. The control has to be operating throughout the entire specified period. So you can't start your audit period until you have cleared all of those gaps successfully. So that, just want to keep that in mind. And then the only other thing I want to highlight in this slide is that, no matter who you choose to do your SOC 2 type 2 or type 1 engagement, make sure that you are doing your research and that you are looking for a qualified CPA firm. There are always going to be low-cost providers, high-cost providers, local firms, national, international. You want to choose the best firm for you, which obviously I'm hoping is always going to be Forvis Mazars, but you want to pick the firm that fits you. And also, don't just always go with what seems the easiest or what seems the cheapest. Make sure you just do your homework on that before you select a provider. So I think our next polling question is here. And so for those of you who haven't joined us before, we do the social hour webcast once a quarter. And so we just want to get your ideas on what might be a good topic or something you might be interested in hearing about next. And so your options are third-party reporting efficiency with SOC 2 Plus, tips to help prepare for your first SOC 1 exam. So basically this, this webcast, but focused on SOC 1 examinations. What is the SOC report and why should I get one? And then protecting your data. So this just helps us determine, what you might be interested in, for going forward in other webcasts.
Karen, I saw a question come in on the policies. Really just to summarize, are there templates that organizations can use to establish their baseline policies?
Yeah, so I mean, the answer to that is definitely yes. A couple of, I guess, side thoughts on that. If someone engages with Forvis Mazars, what we generally would give them is some scrubbed best in class policies, right? Those are always going to be available. We want to give you something that's going to be helpful. If you're truly just looking for something, in all honesty, you can definitely Google these templates, and they are actually really good templates. If that's where a lot of my clients have started. But yes, there's always something available either from the firm that you engage with or definitely online as well.
I'm seeing clients start to use ChatGPT to write policies as well.
Yeah.
So they use that. All right, so we're going to wrap things up. Really great overview, Karen. Appreciate that as far as teeing us up for your first SOC 2. So really kind of closing comments here on what are some tips and tricks and some pitfalls that we've seen. So Karen and I will kind of go through these together, and these are kind of things that we've seen our clients struggle with. I'd say probably first and foremost is change management around segregation of duties and making sure that if we are developing the application, we don't allow developers to push that change to production without some type of review, approval, segregation between those roles. So that's a challenge that we see as organizations mature that space. Karen, other thoughts on challenges or pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think one of the biggest pitfalls I see, and I actually think this might be on the next slide, so sorry if I'm stealing your thunder, Ryan, but the biggest pitfall that I always see is that clients are doing, controls, but they're not documenting it, or they're not documenting it consistently, right? So, if I would say the most important thing when you're going through training exercises with your teams is, let's do this in a consistent way. Let's document changes in a consistent way so we can clearly see, here's who tested it, here's the results, here's who approved it, right? The more consistent you can be in your documentation, I think it's just a lot easier across the board to kind of make sure that you're meeting the control activity.
Yeah, and I would say if you're retaining any evidence, right, maybe it's a year to cover that examination period or more, depending on the regulation that you're exposed to. So if you're in healthcare, you may have a HIPAA requirement or state requirement or a federal requirement to retain that documentation for longer.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely you stole my thunder here, Karen. So
I'd say
documentation. No, I mean, I'd say it's super critical, right? I love this kind of quote, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. I think that's the auditor quote there. We as auditors are kind of mandated to have evidence to support our conclusions. And so as Karen outlined, we have to see what you've done over that period of time to gain that level of confidence. So that's probably a great takeaway, right? So if you don't have great documentation standards in your organization now, probably something to take away and say, hey, before we even start our SOC 2 journey, let's maybe get a process in place, maybe a ticketing system, maybe a culture of documentation, not just for the audit, for more accountability of what the organization is doing, and also continuity of operations. So if we have an employee leave, we can maintain that control as well. Some other things, I think Karen alluded to some of this, is education is crucial, right? Making sure people know what they need to do to get ready for the readiness assessment, what they need to do for the examination. We as consultants in the readiness assessment can provide that knowledge transfer. And I think that's something we always try to do. It's an open book test, right? So we can really come in, we can assess the organization's controls, provide candid feedback, and then let them go and take that away and actually remediate that gap. And so, from our perspective, the readiness assessment is super critical. Karen outlined the importance of that, but also, choosing that auditor, as Karen alluded to, you can use the same audit firm to do the readiness assessment and your examination. And I would say, from our perspective, it's probably better that you choose the same auditor to do both, because that auditor that does a readiness assessment is going to have a much better understanding of your control environment and then help you be successful in that examination. So if you're on that path, would love for you to choose Forvis Mazars. We're definitely here to answer any questions on that. And so let's close out our webinar with our final poll. And so, of course, would love for you to choose me, but I won't take any offense if you choose Karen. If you want to follow up, obviously we'll reach out to you and have a sidebar conversation with you and your team on a SOC 2 report. So with that, we'll kind of close it down. Really appreciate your attendance today. please reach out to us with questions. I'll flash our contact information up. We're passionate about this space, and definitely if you have any SOC reporting needs, please reach out to Forvis Mazars.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it.